Nora Vane didn't flinch when they laughed at her. She had learned long ago that flinching only gave them more to laugh about. She stood in the back of that grand hall, with her hands folded and her chin level, wearing the same gray dress she'd worn to 3 funerals and a wedding, telling herself it didn't matter. She was only there to serve. She was not there to be chosen. Nobody had ever chosen Nora Vane for anything worth remembering. Until today. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow along till the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Nora stood near the back wall with her hands clasped together and her eyes aimed somewhere between the floor and the middle distance. That was where she always positioned herself, near the back, near the wall, near the door. Old habit. When you had spent most of your 23 years being told you were in the way, you learned to find the edges of rooms and stay there. "Don't slouch," someone whispered behind her. She didn't turn around. She already knew the voice. Mrs. Helena Caldwell. The woman had been issuing quiet corrections to anyone within range since the moment the gathering began, as though she personally owned the air inside Ashford Manor and had the God-given right to supervise how it was breathed. "I'm not slouching, ma'am." "You're not standing either. You're hovering, like a servant." "I am a servant, ma'am," Nora said evenly. "That's precisely why I'm here." Mrs. Caldwell made a short sound in her throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. Something in between that managed to carry the full weight of her contempt without the effort of actual words. She swept past Nora without another glance, trailing silk and gardenia water, and went to fuss over the positioning of her daughter Arabella, who was standing third from the left, and didn't need fussing over, but had long since stopped saying so. Nora watched her go. 10 young women, all of them dressed in their finest. All of them from families of name and standing. Families who had received a formal invitation from the household of Mr. Cedric Ashford, called the Duke by everyone in 3 counties, though no one could say exactly when or why the name had stuck, only that it suited him in the way that certain names suit certain men, like something that had always been true and only needed to be spoken aloud. The Duke was selecting a wife. That was the plain fact of it, stripped of the social language that tried to make it sound like something else. He was 34 years old. He controlled the largest private land holding in the Virginia Territory, and he had decided, or his solicitors had decided, or perhaps his late father's will had decided, that it was time to marry. And so 10 families had arrived at Ashford Manor on a Tuesday in October of 1815, each one carrying a daughter and a hope, and a carefully rehearsed list of virtues, and they were going to stand in the Duke's Hall and wait to be looked at. Nora was not among the 10. She was there because Margaret, the head housekeeper, had taken ill 2 days prior, and someone needed to manage the domestic arrangements for the gathering. That someone had turned out to be Nora Vane, daughter of the late Thomas Vane, who had once been a man of moderate business and moderate reputation, until neither of those things had remained true. She had been working in the Ashford household for 14 months. She knew where the linens were kept. She knew how to arrange a table. She knew how to be invisible when visibility was unwanted. She was good at that last one. "Miss Vane." That was Mr. Harwick's voice, and Nora turned toward it without warmth. Josiah Harwick was the Duke's land manager and confidential agent in matters of finance and negotiation, and he had the kind of face that smiled without ever looking pleased, wide across the jaw, narrow across the eyes, always 2 steps ahead of whatever he was pretending to think about. "Mr. Harwick," she said, "are the refreshments in order?" "They are." "And the withdrawing room?" His grace indicated he'd want quiet space available for private conversations. It's ready. Harwick looked at her the way he always looked at her, like he was calculating something and hadn't decided yet whether she was a variable or a constant. You seem calm, he said. Should I be something else? Most women would be nervous. Being in the same room as all this. He gestured vaguely at the assembled brides and their watchful mothers. I'm not competing, Mr. Harwick. I'm working. He smiled, his non-smile. Of course, he said, and moved away. Nora had been working since she was 15. She knew the difference between work and everything else, and she had learned not to confuse the two. Whatever was about to happen in this room, whatever evaluations were going to be performed, whatever hopes were going to be confirmed or destroyed, none of it had anything to do with her. She was here to make sure the candles stayed lit and the tea stayed hot, and the whole orderly machinery of a wealthy man's domestic life kept turning without interruption. She was still telling herself that when the Duke walked in. She felt it before she saw it. That particular shift in a room, when the person everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. The way the air seems to rearrange itself, and everybody in the space recalibrates, just slightly, just enough to betray attention. The 10 young women didn't turn all at once. They were too well trained for that. But their shoulders moved, their chins lifted, their eyes cut sideways without quite moving. Nora turned. Cedric Ashford was not a handsome man in the way that word usually got used. He wasn't pretty. He was tall, and he was broad, and he moved like a man who had never in his life been required to make himself smaller for anyone else's comfort. His coat was good wool, plainly cut. His expression gave away nothing at all. He walked into his own hall as though he were walking into a room he hadn't quite decided to enter yet, and his eyes moved across the assembled women with the efficient, unreadable attention of a man reviewing a ledger. He stopped. He stood at the center of the room for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. And the silence in that moment was the kind that women like Mrs. Caldwell couldn't control and couldn't fill, which Nora suspected was exactly why he let it sit. Then he said, "No." Mrs. Caldwell's intake of breath was audible. "I beg your pardon." That was Mrs. Price, whose daughter Eleanor was standing first in the row and had been given to understand, based on several highly suggestive social signals over the past season, that her position was favorable. "I said no," the Duke repeated, with exactly the same tone he might have used to decline a second helping of bread. He wasn't angry. He wasn't apologetic. He was simply stating a fact that had apparently become clear to him. Not any of them. The room did not erupt. It couldn't, not in polite company, not with that many years of collective social training in the room, but it shifted in a way that was almost worse than erupting. A terrible, airless stillness. 10 young women who had been told they were candidates, suddenly realizing they were rejections. Their mothers processing the insult in real time and deciding each one how much of it they would allow to show. Arabella Caldwell pressed her lips together. Eleanor Price looked at the floor. "Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Caldwell's voice was controlled to the edge of control. "Perhaps you might care to take a moment." "I've taken a moment," he said. He hadn't moved. He was still standing in the middle of the room, and his gaze had shifted. Not to any of the 10 women along the wall, not to the mothers in the chairs, but to the back of the room, to the door, to the space near the door where Nora was standing with her hands folded and her face arranged into the expression she wore when she was working. The one that was meant to say, "I am not here. Please do not look at me." He was looking directly at her. "You," he said. "What is your name?" Nora's hands tightened against each other. "Nora Vane, sir." Vane. He said the name the way people sometimes said it, with a slight pause, like they were deciding whether to set it down or carry it further. "Thomas Vane's daughter?" "Yes, sir." Something moved behind his eyes. "Come here." She didn't move immediately. Not from defiance. She wasn't defiant by nature, not outwardly. But because the instruction made no sense, and her mind was still attempting to process it into something that did. There were 10 women standing along that wall who had traveled from as far as Fredericksburg and Petersburg to be in this room. And this man was asking the housekeeper to come forward. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, "I believe there may be some confusion. I'm not—" "I know what you are," he said. "Come here." She came. The walk across that room was the longest she could ever recall making. She was aware of every eye, the mother's calculating, the daughter's uncomprehending, Harwick in the corner watching with his calculating expression, the Duke himself standing still and unreadable at the center of everything. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked up at him and kept her face level. "You've been managing this household for Margaret," he said. "Yes, sir." "How long has Margaret been ill?" "Since Sunday last, sir. She expects to recover within the week." "And before Margaret, you worked under the direction of Mrs. Harrison?" "That's correct." He was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" 23, sir." "You can read." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes." "And figure accounts?" Something careful moved through her. "Well enough for household purposes." "Can you ride?" Behind her, she heard the faintest sound from the row of noble women, something between a breath and a laugh, quickly suppressed. "Can you ride?" What on earth was he asking a housekeeper whether she could ride for? "Passably, sir," she said. "Do you speak French?" "A little. I read it better than I speak it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned to the room, not to any one person in it, but to all of it, to the assembled mothers and daughters, and the watching eyes, and the wounded pride, and the careful social machinery that had brought 10 families here today, and was now watching that machinery produce something it had not been built to produce. "The gathering is concluded," he said. "You're welcome to stay for the afternoon's refreshments. You'll receive my regards in writing." He looked at Nora again. "I'll speak with you in the study at 4 o'clock. Don't be late." And he left. He left like a man who didn't require anything further from any of them. And the room that he left behind was the kind of room that takes several seconds to remember how to breathe. Mrs. Caldwell found her voice first. "Well," she said, not to anyone in particular, just "well," in the tone of a woman who has encountered something so far outside the acceptable parameters of her world that language briefly fails her. "Who is she?" someone said, and Nora did not have to look to know that the question was not directed at her, but about her, and that the woman who asked it was one of the mothers, and that the question was not an inquiry, but an opening movement in something that hadn't finished starting yet. "Thomas Vane's daughter," Mrs. Caldwell said, and she said it the way people had been saying it for 8 years, since Nora's father had lost the shipping business and the house on Broad Street, and most of what followed, with the precise mixture of pity and scorn that made those 3 words mean nobody, nothing. Don't look too closely. Nora was already moving toward the door. "Miss Vane." Arabella Caldwell. She was the last person Nora expected to speak to her directly. Arabella was 20, well-trained, and had the kind of beauty that required maintenance, and knew it. They were not friends. They had never been anything to each other. "Miss Caldwell," Nora said. Arabella looked at her with something that might have been genuine confusion, or might have been the beginning of a more calculated emotion. "What does he want with you?" "I don't know, Miss Caldwell." "He called you by name." "He did." "How does he know your name?" Nora thought about that. She had been in this household for 14 months. She had managed linens and accounts and the daily business of a large domestic operation. She had never, in 14 months, had a direct conversation with Cedric Ashford. She had passed him in hallways. She had received his directives through intermediaries. She had existed in the margins of his house, the same way she existed in the margins of everything, useful and unseen. How did he know her name? "I work here," she said, because it was the only answer she had, and she went through the door before anyone could ask her anything else. She had 3 hours before 4 o'clock. She spent the first of them in the kitchen with the cook, making sure the refreshments were properly arranged, and the afternoon would run without incident, regardless of whatever was happening in the grander parts of the house. She spent the second helping one of the younger housemaids with a hem that had come loose. Tilda, 16 and easily rattled, talking her through the repair with the patient, methodical attention she gave to everything that needed doing. Her hands moved and her voice stayed even, and she did not think about the study or the man who would be waiting in it. She thought about it anyway. "Miss Nora," Tilda said. Her needle paused. "What do you think he wants?" "I think he wants to speak with me about the household management," Nora said, because that was the reasonable explanation, the sensible one, the one that didn't require her to consider any of the alternatives. Tilda looked at her with the direct, unfiltered skepticism that only very young people could produce without apology. "He didn't look at you like he wanted to talk about linens. Tilda, he looked at you like you were the only person in the room." "You'll pull the thread too tight if you're not careful," Nora said. And Tilda went back to her sewing, and Nora went back to not thinking about 4 o'clock. At 3:55, she folded her work, straightened her dress, and walked upstairs. The study door was open. He was already there, standing behind the large desk rather than sitting at it, and he had a paper in his hand that he set down when she entered. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her downstairs, direct, unreadable, without the social performance that most men of his position adopted when speaking to women who worked for them. "Miss Vane," he said, "close the door." She closed it and stood just inside the room. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand, sir, if it's all the same." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something that acknowledged the preference without arguing it. "Suit yourself." He moved around the desk and crossed to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your father was Thomas Vane." "Yes, sir. You mentioned that downstairs." "I did. I also knew your father, Miss Vane. Not well, but I knew of him, and I knew his business." She was quiet. "The shipping company," he said. "He lost it in 1807. There was a fire. The insurance claim was contested. He spent 4 years in a legal dispute. He ultimately didn't win, and by the end of it, the money was gone, and the business was gone, and 3 years later, he was dead. That's the story as it's generally told." "That's accurate enough," Nora said. "Is it?" She looked at him. "Sir?" He turned from the window. "Your father maintained an account with a private trust house in Philadelphia from approximately 1804 until his death. The account was opened in his name, but structured as a family trust, with a secondary named beneficiary. That secondary beneficiary—" He paused, and his eyes were steady on her face. "Was you." The air in the room did something it hadn't done a moment ago. Nora heard her own voice from a place that felt very far from her body. "I don't know what you're referring to, sir." "I think you might," he said. "My father died with nothing. That was the story," he said, not unkindly. "I know what the story is. I'm telling you what I found when I looked behind it." She stood very still and did not say anything. Outside the study door, somewhere in the house, she could hear the sound of the afternoon gathering proceeding. voices, movement, the managed social noise of an occasion trying to recover from what had happened to it. 10 women who had come here to be chosen. 10 women who had been told, clearly and without ceremony, that they were not. And here was the housekeeper, alone in the study, listening to the Duke of Ashford tell her that her dead father had left her something. "Why?" she said, finally. He looked at her. "Why what? Why are you telling me this?" Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "Why did you call me out of that room in front of every family of consequence in the county and bring me in here to tell me about a trust account? You could have sent a solicitor's letter. You could have had Mr. Harwick speak to me in an office somewhere and handed me a paper to sign, and that would have been the end of it. Why?" She stopped herself, steadied herself. "Why me? In front of all of them? In that room?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because," he said slowly, "I have a proposal to make to you, and I needed you to hear it without an audience. But I also needed them to see that I had chosen to make it." The silence that followed was the loudest Nora Vane had ever stood inside of. "A proposal," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "I think," Nora said very carefully, "that you had better explain what you mean by that, sir." And the Duke of Ashford, the man who had turned away 10 noble daughters without a second glance, who managed half the territory's land rights and moved through every room like he owned it, which mostly he did, looked at her across the desk of his study in the October light and said, "I mean exactly what the word means, Miss Vane. And before you say no, and I expect you will say no, at least once, I want you to understand that I have been watching this house run for 14 months, and I have been watching who runs it. And I want you to understand something else." He picked up the paper he had set down when she entered and held it toward her. "Your father didn't lose everything, Nora. Someone made it look like he did. And the man who did it," he paused, "he's in this house." Nora did not reach for the paper. She stood exactly where she was, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on his face. And she let the words settle the way you let something settle, when you're not sure yet whether it's going to break something on the way down. "In this house," she said. "Yes." "You're telling me the man who destroyed my father's livelihood and let him die believing he'd failed his family, that man is currently eating refreshments in your parlor?" "I'm telling you he was invited here today. Whether he stayed for refreshments, I couldn't say." Something cold moved through her chest. Not grief exactly. Not anger exactly. Something older than either of those. She had spent 8 years carrying the weight of her father's failure like it was her own inheritance, which, in every practical sense, it had been. She had worked kitchens and counting rooms and eventually this house, and she had told herself that the story she'd been given was the true one, that her father had been unlucky, had made poor decisions, had lost the thing he'd built through some combination of misfortune and human error. She had made a kind of peace with that story. Not a good peace, but a functional one. "Who is it?" she said. "I want to tell you carefully." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it isn't. But it's the one I'm giving you right now, because the moment I give you the name, you're going to want to go find him. And I need you to hear the rest of it first." Nora looked at him hard. "You don't know me well enough to know what I'd do." "I know that you've been holding yourself very still for the past 3 minutes," he said, "and that you're not the kind of woman who holds still because she's frightened. You're holding still because you're deciding. And I'm asking you to wait until you've heard me out before you decide anything." She didn't answer that, but she didn't move toward the door either. He set the paper down on the desk between them and pushed it forward. She looked at it without touching it. Columns of figures, dates, a trust ledger, she realized. the kind produced by Philadelphia financial houses, detailed and careful and official-looking, in the way that only documents produced to be examined closely ever were. "Your father opened this account in 1804, he said. He was building towards something. The shipping company was doing well that year, and he was cautious by nature. He didn't want everything in one place, so he put a portion aside, quarterly, for 3 years. The total, by 1807, was just over $4,000. $4,000. Nora had grown up in a house where a new dress was an occasion, and boots were resold twice before being replaced. $4,000 was not a number she associated with her father's life. "When the fire happened," the Duke continued, "and the legal dispute began, your father's attorney petitioned for access to the trust funds to cover legal costs. The petition was reviewed and approved by a trustee agent. The money was released." He paused. "It was released to the wrong account." "The wrong—" Nora stopped. "You mean it was stolen?" "I mean it was redirected. Legally, on paper, with signatures. The kind of redirection that looks like proper process until you read the documents against each other. And then it looks like something else entirely." "How long have you known this?" "I found the first discrepancy 4 months ago," he said. "I've spent the time since then verifying it." 4 months. She heard her own voice go flat. "You've known for 4 months, and you're telling me now." "I'm telling you now because I have enough to do something about it. 4 months ago, I had a suspicion. A suspicion isn't worth anything to a woman in your position." "And what is my position?" He looked at her steadily. "It's better than it was this morning," he said. "That's the point." Nora picked up the ledger. She looked at it the way she looked at household accounts, methodically, tracking the numbers without attaching feeling to them yet, because feeling would come later, and she needed to understand it first. The columns were clear once you knew what you were looking at. Deposits, quarterly. Withdrawal, single entry, June 1807. Destination account identified by a series of numbers that meant nothing to her. A signature she didn't recognize in the approval line. "Whose signature is this?" she said. "The trustee agent who processed the petition." "And who was that?" He was quiet for just a beat longer than neutral. "Josiah Harwick," he said, "who has been in my employ for the past 6 years. The name hit her somewhere between the ribs. She had spoken to Josiah Harwick not 2 hours ago. She had stood in this very house and answered his questions, and watched him look at her with those calculating eyes that were always running numbers she couldn't see. And she had thought, the way she always thought about Harwick, that he was simply the kind of man who treated everyone like a transaction. She had not thought he was the kind of man who had looked at her father's ruin and put his name to it. She set the ledger down very carefully. "He was the agent," she said. "He was. He processed the petition. He authorized the release. He directed the funds." He paused. "He was also, at that time, a junior partner in a competing shipping concern that benefited considerably from your father's collapse. He profited directly." Nora was quiet for a long time, long enough that the Duke didn't try to fill the silence, which she noted and filed away. Men who could sit in silence without trying to own it were rarer than they thought. "You said you had a proposal," she finally said. "I do." "I'm listening." He moved back to the desk and stood behind it, not using it as a barrier, she thought, but as something to do with his hands, a way to anchor himself in a conversation that clearly had more moving pieces than the room could comfortably contain. "I need a witness," he said. "Someone who can testify, legally and credibly, to the details of the original trust arrangement. Someone with standing. "I have no standing," she said. "I'm a housekeeper." "You're the named beneficiary. That gives you legal standing in the trust dispute. More importantly, it gives you standing that can't be easily dismissed, because any attempt to discredit you also discredits the documents, and the documents are sound." "You want me to take Harwick to court?" "I want to take Harwick to court. I want you to participate in that process, yes. But that's not the whole of it." He looked at her. "Harwick is not the only one. There are others, in the land office, in the county court, a network of men who have been using legal instruments to redirect inheritance and property away from people who don't have the resources to fight back. Your father's case is one of at least 7 I've identified. He just happened to be the one whose family ended up in my house." "Why do you care?" she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice. Not hostile exactly, but sharp. The edge of a woman who had learned that when men of means expressed interest in the causes of people without means, there was almost always a reason that circled back to the men of means. "What is it to you?" Something in his expression shifted. Not defensiveness, something quieter. "My mother," he said, "was not born to this house. She married into it. When my father died, there were men who thought that meant the estate was in play. They tried several of the same instruments: misdirected accounts, contested inheritance, document irregularities. My father's solicitor caught it in time. My mother kept the land. But I was 15 when it happened, and I watched what it did to her. The year of it, the fighting and the fear, and the way she woke up every morning not knowing if the house she was standing in would still be hers by evening." He paused. "I have not forgotten what that looks like." Nora looked at him. "That's not a complete answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. The complete answer is that I want Harwick gone. I want the network he operates in dismantled. And I need someone who has a stake in the outcome to stand with me when I do it. An impersonal legal complaint from a man of my position will be managed. It'll be delayed, redirected, quietly resolved in ways that protect the people involved. But a named beneficiary, a woman, standing up in a legal proceeding to say, 'This was my father's money and it was taken.'" He shook his head. "That's a different conversation. You want to use me. I want to work with you. There's a difference." "There is," she said, "but people in your position don't always notice it." He didn't flinch at that, didn't apologize for it. He met her eyes and said, "That's fair," and nothing else. And somehow that was worse in a particular way than if he'd pushed back, because she had built a very functional set of defenses against men who argued with her or dismissed her or talked over her, and she had almost no defenses at all against men who listened. "You said a proposal," she said, "not a legal arrangement, a proposal." "Yes. Those are different things." "They are." She waited. He took a breath. "I need someone in this house who I can trust entirely. Margaret is a good woman, but she's aging, and she's loyal to patterns rather than people. She'll follow whoever gives the orders. Harwick has had access to this household's operations for 6 years, and I've spent the last 4 months realizing I don't know what else he may have touched. I need someone whose interests are genuinely opposed to his, someone with reason to be watchful." He looked at her. "I'm asking you to stay, in a different capacity, not as a housekeeper." "As what?" "As my wife." The word sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. Present, unmistakable, already sending rings in every direction that couldn't be called back. Nora did not make a sound. She stood inside the silence of that word, and did not make a sound, and did not move, and kept her face level with every skill she had accumulated in 23 years of being the kind of person who was not supposed to have feelings in the presence of people who did. "That," she said finally, "is the most practical proposal anyone has ever made in the history of proposals." "I'm a practical man." "You rejected 10 women of quality to ask the housekeeper to marry you." "I rejected 10 women I didn't know in favor of one woman I have 14 months of evidence on. That's not romance. That's accounting." Something unwound in her chest. Not warmth, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized itself in the shape of that answer. "You don't know me," she said. "I know how you run a household under pressure. I know you're fair to the staff and firm when you need to be. I know you can read and figure accounts, and that you speak plainly to people who outrank you and don't apologize for it." He paused. "That's more than most people know about anyone they agree to marry." "This is insane," she said. "Probably." "The county will talk." "The county talks already. I don't generally let that govern my decisions. Harwick will know immediately that something has changed." "Yes, which is why timing matters." He picked up the ledger. "I'm filing documents with the Philadelphia Trust House next week. Once that process starts, it becomes difficult for him to interfere without making his interference obvious. But between now and then..." The door opened. Not a knock, not a pause, just the door opening, and Josiah Harwick standing in the frame of it, with a face arranged into the expression of a man who had simply come to deliver a message, and found nothing he hadn't expected to find. "Forgive the interruption," Harwick said, looking between them. His eyes moved to the desk, to the ledger, back to Nora. "The families are beginning to take their leave. Several of the mothers have requested a formal word from you before they go." "Tell them I'll be out shortly," the Duke said. Harwick didn't move immediately. His eyes stayed on Nora for a fraction longer than the situation required. "Of course," he said. "Miss Vane." And then he closed the door. The room changed the instant he was gone. Not in any visible way, just in the way that rooms change when a particular kind of pressure has briefly been present in them and then removed. "He saw the ledger," Nora said. "Yes." "Does he know what you have?" "He will by morning," the Duke said. He set the ledger down. "Which means my timeline just moved." Nora looked at him. "How far?" "The filing I plan for next week. I need to send a rider to Philadelphia tonight." He looked at her. "And I need your answer before he leaves this property." There it was. The thing that had been building since he'd walked into his own hall and said the word no to 10 carefully selected women, and looked at the back of the room instead. The thing she had been managing and processing and holding at a careful distance. And here it was, present and unavoidable, and asking her to decide. Her father's money. Her father's name. 8 years of second-hand grief for a failure that hadn't been a failure at all, but a theft. A careful and legal theft by a man who was currently 30 feet away, making pleasantries with the mothers of women he had just helped to humiliate. Her hands were steady. She noticed that about herself. "I have conditions," she said. Something eased in his expression. "I expect you do." "The legal proceedings. I'm not a figurehead. I want to understand everything. Every document, every step. I won't sign anything I haven't read." "Agreed." "The staff in this house are treated fairly. That doesn't change based on my position." "It hasn't changed in 6 years. It won't change now." She looked at him. "And if this arrangement, if it becomes something other than practical?" "Then we'll discuss it," he said, "like practical people." It was not a romantic answer. It was not the answer of a man reading from a script about love and destiny and the ordained purposes of the heart. It was the answer of a man who was telling her the truth as clearly as he knew how to tell it, and leaving the rest open. Nora had heard many pretty answers in her life. She had never trusted a single one of them. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right. Send your rider to Philadelphia." She picked up the ledger and held it out to him. "And when you go speak to those mothers, don't apologize." He took the ledger. "I wasn't going to." "Good." She moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. "Mr. Ashford." "Miss Vane." "Harwick looked at this ledger the same way he looked at my father's account in 1807, she said, like he was already calculating the exit. She paused. "He won't be slow about it." The Duke's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. An alertness, sharp and focused. The look of a man shifting from one kind of problem to another. "Neither will I," he said. She went out the door and pulled it closed behind her, and she stood in the hallway for exactly 2 seconds, with her eyes shut and her hands pressed flat against the wood. She could hear voices from the parlor, the managed social sounds of departure, the rustle of preparations to leave, someone laughing at something that probably wasn't funny. 2 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and walked down the hallway toward the sound of everything that was about to come apart. Harwick was at the bottom of the stairs. He had a glass in his hand and a pleasant expression on his face, and he watched her come down toward him with the particular attention of a man who has just done a rapid recalculation and arrived at a number he doesn't like. "Miss Vane," he said pleasantly, "that was quite an afternoon." "It was," she said, and she kept walking. "Unusual for a man like Mr. Ashford to change his plans so entirely." He turned slightly to follow her movement. "In my experience, he's not an impulsive man." "In mine either," she said. "So one wonders," Harwick said, softly, conversationally, in the tone of a man who is not wondering at all, but is making a specific point. What it was that changed his mind. Or, a small pause, who? Nora stopped. She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, at the careful face and the calculating eyes and the pleasant expression that had nothing pleasant behind it. And she thought about a document in a Philadelphia trust house with his name in the approval line. And she thought about her father's last years. And she thought about the specific quality of cold that she felt when she thought about both of those things at the same time. "I couldn't say, Mr. Harwick," she said. "You'd have to ask him." She walked away and didn't look back. And behind her she heard Harwick say nothing at all, which was somehow louder than anything he could have said. The parlor was crowded with the business of departure. Mothers collecting daughters, servants gathering wraps, the formal exchanges that had to occur before people could separate without social incident. Nora moved through it with her hands steady and her face arranged, and her mind running the ledger figures over and over, looking for the places where they connected to things she thought she already knew, and finding, with each pass, that they connected more deeply and in more directions than she'd understood before. She was halfway across the room when Arabella Caldwell stepped into her path. "My mother wants to leave," Arabella said. "She wants to say something to Mr. Ashford first." "He'll be down in a moment." Arabella looked at her. The calculation in her expression was different from her mother's, less practiced, more honest. A young woman genuinely trying to understand something that didn't fit the shape of her world. "Did he ask you to marry him?" she said. Nora looked at her. "Because Eliza Price is telling everyone he did, and half of them don't believe it, and my mother is—" Arabella stopped. "I just want to know if it's true." Nora considered the question. She considered the room full of women who had come here today, carrying expectations that had been carefully built over months and were now in pieces on the floor. She considered what truth would do in this room right now, and what kindness looked like, and whether those two things were the same or different. "Miss Caldwell," she said, "whatever happened in that study is between Mr. Ashford and me, and it won't benefit either of us for it to become a parlor discussion today." She met Arabella's eyes. "What I will tell you is that nothing that happened today was about you. It was never about any of you. And that's not a small thing to know." Arabella stared at her for a moment. Then something in her face softened. Just slightly. Just enough. "You're strange," she said. "I've been told," Nora said, and kept moving. She had almost reached the far door when she heard it. Mrs. Caldwell's voice, from somewhere behind her. Not loud, but carrying, in the particular way of a woman who had been trained to fill rooms without raising her volume. "Thomas Vane's daughter! Good Lord! What can he be thinking?" And then, lower, a man's voice. Harwick's. Close to Mrs. Caldwell, private, angled away from the room. She caught only 5 words of it before the crowd noise covered the rest. "Won't last. I'll see to—" Nora kept walking. Her face was level. Her hands were steady. She reached the door and went through it, and pressed her back against the wall of the corridor beyond, and stared at the ceiling, and breathed. "I'll see to it." Those 3 words, that voice, the specific texture of a threat made comfortable by long practice. She thought about the rider that needed to go to Philadelphia tonight. She thought about timing. She thought about a document with a forged authorization line, and 6 years of a man operating freely inside a household he had treated as his own private instrument. She thought about her father, who had believed himself a failure. She pushed off the wall and went to find the Duke. She found him in the east corridor, moving toward the parlor with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to say and to whom. She fell into step beside him without waiting to be acknowledged, and she kept her voice low and her words direct. "Harwick," she said. "He spoke to Mrs. Caldwell just now. I caught the edge of it. He said, and these are the words I heard clearly, 'Won't last. I'll see to it.'" The Duke didn't break stride, but something in the set of his jaw shifted. "How long ago?" 2 minutes, maybe 3. "Did he see you hear it?" "No." He stopped walking, turned to her, looked at her with the focused, undecorated attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at problems he was serious about solving. "The rider I said I'd send tonight. I need him to leave before the last family clears the drive. If Harwick has ears at the posting road, a rider leaving after the guests is less conspicuous than one leaving during the departure." "You think he has ears at the posting road?" "I think he's had 6 years to build whatever he needed," the Duke said flatly. "I've been operating on the assumption that he has eyes everywhere he could reasonably put them. That assumption has served me better than the alternative." Nora thought about that. "Who do you trust to carry the documents?" "My man Levi. He's been with me since before Harwick." He looked down the corridor. "I need 5 minutes to write the letter. Can you manage the parlor until I come back?" "I've been managing your parlor for 14 months, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "So you have." He turned and went the other direction without another word. And Nora went to the parlor and stepped inside and picked up the thread of the afternoon's social machinery as though she had never put it down. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The management of surfaces, the maintenance of the appearance of normalcy, while something entirely different moved underneath. She had learned it young, in the years after her father's business collapsed, watching her mother hold their reduced circumstances together with nothing but the force of consistent presentation. You kept your voice even. You kept your face arranged. You gave people nothing to read that you hadn't already chosen to show them. Mrs. Caldwell was holding court near the window, her daughter standing beside her with the patient expression of a woman who had long since learned that her mother's court was not optional to attend. Two other mothers, Mrs. Price and a woman Nora vaguely recognized as Mrs. Fenwick from the Shenandoah side, were listening with the focused attention of women who were deciding in real time how to incorporate today's unexpected events into the stories they would tell about it later. Nora moved through the room. She checked the tea. She spoke briefly to the servants managing the departure arrangements. She was aware of Harwick the entire time. He was near the far door, speaking with Mr. Caldwell, who had arrived an hour ago to collect his wife and daughter, and who possessed, in Nora's assessment, roughly half the social perception of either of them. Harwick was easy with him, comfortable. The ease of a man who had spent years being easy with people who didn't look closely enough. She watched him without watching him, a skill her mother had also taught her, though her mother would have been horrified at the application. "Miss Vane!" She turned. Mrs. Price. Up close, Eleanor's mother was a small, precise woman with sharp gray eyes and the bearing of someone who had grown up with less than she currently had and remembered it. She looked at Nora the way people looked at things they were reassessing, not unkindly, but with the particular intensity of revised attention. "Mrs. Price," Nora said. "I'll come directly to the point," Mrs. Price said, in the tone of a woman who always came directly to the point and considered it a virtue. "My daughter is not devastated. I want you to know that. Eleanor is a sensible girl, and she understands that these things don't always resolve the way one hopes." A pause. "I am, however, curious, not resentfully, genuinely." "About what, ma'am?" "About you." Mrs. Price studied her. "Thomas Vane's daughter. I knew of your father, not well. He was a decent man." The words landed somewhere soft. People didn't often say that about her father anymore. His name had become a shorthand for a particular kind of failure, and the decent man inside it had gotten buried under the years. "He was," Nora said. "What happened to him was not entirely of his own making," Mrs. Price said, and she said it quietly, almost offhandedly, like a thing she was thinking out loud rather than delivering. "I always suspected that. The way the legal dispute moved, too fast in the wrong direction. Too many doors closed before he could reach them." She looked at Nora steadily. "I hope you find what you're looking for here." Nora looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "Whatever it is you came here for," Mrs. Price said, "I hope you find it." She moved away before Nora could answer. There was no time to sit with that. There was never time to sit with anything today. The afternoon was running like a current, fast and directional, and staying upright in it required constant adjustment. The Duke returned to the parlor 7 minutes later. Nora knew the moment he entered, because the room did the thing that rooms did when he entered. That recalibration, that subtle shift of attention, and she watched from across it as he moved through the departure conversations with the efficiency of a man closing out accounts. He was gracious. He was not warm. He said the appropriate things and shook the appropriate hands and walked each family to the edge of their departure with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing these rituals since childhood and no longer required effort for them. He was also watching Harwick the entire time. She could see it in the angle of his attention. Never direct, never obvious, but consistent. The way a man watches something he's decided needs watching, without alerting it to the fact that it's being watched. Harwick, for his part, was performing departure as well, helping with coats, exchanging final pleasantries, the picture of a loyal, useful employee, managing the close of a difficult afternoon with professional competence. His face gave away nothing. Levi, the Duke's man, slipped out through the servants' entrance at the eastern end of the house. Nora saw it happen. Harwick did not, or if he did, he gave no sign. The last carriage rolled down the drive 20 minutes later. Mrs. Caldwell's. Arabella turned once at the door and looked back at Nora. Not with hostility, not with anything Nora could name precisely. Just a long look that seemed to be finishing a thought. And then she was gone. The house went quiet. The particular quiet of a large place after a crowd has vacated it. Not peaceful, but suddenly, pressurously, empty. "Mr. Harwick." The Duke's voice came from the center of the entrance hall, and it had a different quality than it had carried all afternoon. Not raised, not hard, just different in the way that a door sounds different when it's been locked from the one it sounds like when it's merely closed. Harwick turned. "Sir, the trust documents, the ones I had assembled from the Philadelphia house regarding the Vane account." He paused. "I'd like them brought to the study." Something moved across Harwick's face and was gone in under a second. If Nora hadn't been watching for exactly that movement, she would have missed it. "Of course," Harwick said. "I'll have them retrieved from the filing room. Now, if you don't mind." Naturally. He moved toward the back corridor. Nora looked at the Duke. He looked back at her. He gave the smallest shake of his head, one motion, controlled, and she understood it without requiring translation. Not yet. Wait. She waited. 4 minutes passed. Harwick came back with a leather case, which he set on the entry table and unclasped with the smooth efficiency of a man performing a familiar action. He drew out a stack of documents, organized and bound, and held them toward the Duke. The Duke took them, looked at them, turned through the first several pages with the attention of a man who knew what he was looking at. He stopped. "Mr. Harwick," he said, "the authorization record from June 1807. The one bearing the trust agent's signature. It should be the third document in." "I believe it is, sir." "It isn't." He held up the stack. "It's not here." Harwick's expression arranged itself into concerned puzzlement. "That's unusual. The documents were complete when I filed them." "When did you last review them?" "Several months ago, I believe, before the—" He caught himself, just barely, just enough to be visible to anyone watching for catches. "Before the quarterly accounts review." "Several months ago," the Duke repeated. "Perhaps it was misfiled. These things happen in a busy household." "The document doesn't misfile itself, Josiah." The use of his given name changed the air in the room. Harwick felt it. Nora felt it. The shift from Mr. Harwick, formal and transactional, to Josiah, which said something else entirely. Said, "I know you, and I have been watching you," and the distance between us just closed. "I'll look into it immediately," Harwick said. "You do that." The Duke set the stack down. "And while you're looking, also explain to me why a trust account bearing your signature in the authorization line was directing funds to a separate account registered to a shell concern in Philadelphia, whose principal shareholder, as of 1808, was you." Silence. Not the silence of a room that has gone quiet. The silence of a room that has been detonated. Harwick stood very still. His face did not collapse. He was too skilled for that. But something behind it went very cold, very fast. The way water goes still right before it freezes. "That's a serious allegation," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. "It's a documented fact," the Duke said. "The allegation would be what I call it next. You would be calling it based on documents you haven't had independently verified. I've had them verified for 4 months." A pause. "The authorization record that's missing from this file. I have the original. I kept it separate. specifically because I anticipated it might not survive the afternoon in your custody." Harwick looked at him. A long, assessing look. The look of a man running calculations at full speed and arriving, one by one, at conclusions he doesn't want. "You've been building this for months," Harwick said. Quiet. Almost, she thought, almost admiring, in the specific way of a calculating man who recognizes calculation in someone else. "I have. And the woman." His eyes moved to Nora, briefly, and then back. "She's part of it." "She's the named beneficiary in a legal proceeding, yes."
"You pulled her out of the back of that room today," Harwick said slowly,
"in front of every family of standing in the county. You rejected 10 legitimate candidates and called the housekeeper forward, not because of any proposal. You did it so they would all see it. So there would be 30 witnesses who could confirm, if asked, that you singled her out publicly. That makes her position harder to erase." He looked at Nora. "He used you." "He informed me of it fully and asked for my consent," she said. "That's different from what you did to my father." Something in Harwick shifted. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know what $4,000 looks like in a ledger," Nora said. "And I know what a redirected account looks like next to it. And I know what your name looks like in the authorization line." She held his gaze. "So do the courts in Philadelphia." "The writer." Harwick said it softly. He looked at the Duke. "The rider who left during the departures." "Levi rides fast," the Duke said. Harwick was quiet for a moment, that stretched and stretched. Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound that carried no warmth at all. "You've been careful," he said. "I'll grant you that. But you've been careful in the way of a man who thinks he's covered every position." He straightened his coat. "You haven't." "Tell me which one I missed." "The county land office," Harwick said. "Judge Alderman has held the deed registry for 11 years. He and I have an arrangement that significantly predates your investigation. Any legal filing you make in this jurisdiction goes through his office. Any document that requires county authentication," he paused, "gets reviewed by a man who is not your friend." The Duke said nothing. "You can send riders to Philadelphia," Harwick continued. "You can build whatever case you like with whatever documents you have. But when it comes time to enforce it in Virginia," he met the Duke's eyes, "you'll find the ground less solid than you thought." Nora watched the Duke's face. It didn't change in the way she expected. He didn't harden, didn't tighten. Instead, he did the thing she was coming to recognize as his particular tell. That very slight, very controlled stillness that meant he had just arrived at a decision. "The deed registry," he said. "You mean the one that was audited by the Federal Land Office last month?" Harwick stopped. "Pursuant to the Land Act enforcement proceedings," the Duke continued, "which I requested through a contact in Washington City approximately 6 weeks ago. The audit is complete. Alderman's office has been under federal review since Thursday." He paused. "Judge Alderman is, as of this morning, no longer in a position to do anything for anyone." The room changed again. Nora felt it, a fundamental shift, the moment when the thing that had been balanced precariously finally came down. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, definitive sound of something collapsing. Harwick's face did something then that none of his training or skill could quite manage. It went uncertain, genuinely uncertain. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the board he was playing on has more pieces than he knew. "You planned this," he said. "All of it. The gathering, the woman, the timing." "I plan to expose you," the Duke said. "The rest arranged itself." Harwick looked at Nora. He looked at her the way he had looked at her father's account once, like he was trying to find the exit inside something that had stopped having one. "You could have handled this quietly," he said. "Man to man. Come to me privately, given me the opportunity to redirect the situation," Nora said. "To find another door. To buy enough time to destroy what you couldn't redirect." She kept her voice even. "That's what you did to my father. He was a decent man who believed in dealing privately, man to man, through the proper channels. And every proper channel he went through had your arrangement already inside it." She paused. "No, there's no private handling. Not this time." Harwick looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that might have been, not regret. She didn't believe in Harwick's regret. But something like acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who recognizes that the story has gone somewhere he can't follow. "You're Thomas Vane's daughter," he said quietly. "You have his way of standing." "I'll take that," she said. The Duke moved to the door and opened it. Two men she had not seen before, neither of them servants, both of them with the build and bearing of men employed for purposes other than domestic, were standing in the entrance. She didn't know where they had come from. She understood, in the moment she saw them, that they had been here all along. "Mr. Harwick," the Duke said, "these gentlemen will accompany you. There are federal deputies riding from Winchester. They should arrive by morning." Harwick looked at the two men, looked at the Duke. Something final happened in his expression. The last calculation, the one that came up empty. "You thought of everything," he said. "Not everything," the Duke said. "I didn't account for the authorization record going missing. I should have moved the documents sooner." "Why didn't you?" A pause. "Because I didn't expect you to act during a social gathering. I underestimated your nerve." He looked at Harwick without anger, without satisfaction, with the steady, unglamorous attention of a man finishing a job he'd started. "That won't happen again." They took Harwick through the East Passage. The house went quiet for the second time that afternoon. A different quiet this time. Not the pressured emptiness of a crowd departed, but the long exhale of something released. Nora stood in the entrance hall and listened to it. The Duke came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The afternoon light had gone low and golden, and it came through the windows at an angle that made everything look like the end of something, which she supposed it was. "The authorization record," she said finally. "You actually have it." "I do. It's in my coat, actually." He reached in and produced a single folded document, clean and intact. "It never went into the main file." "You told him you had it separately." "Yes." "But you didn't tell him where it was." "No." She looked at the document in his hand. Her father's name was on it. She could see that much from where she stood. The letterhead, the trust name, the date in the upper corner. 1807, 8 years ago, and a whole other life. "Can I see it?" she said. He held it out to her. She took it. She read it all the way through, every line, the way she read everything, carefully, without rushing, giving each word its proper weight. Her father's account number, the amount, the authorization signature, Harwick's name in a clerk's hand, clean and official and utterly damning. She folded it along its original creases and handed it back. "He said I had my father's way of standing," she said. "He did." "I think that was the truest thing he said all day." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The federal deputies will want a statement from you when they arrive. Tonight, if you're willing." "I'm willing," It may be a long night." "I've had long nights," she said. "I know how to manage them." He looked at her then, really looked at her, not with the assessing attention of their earlier conversations, but with something that sat differently, something that didn't have a category yet, but was clearly trying to find one. "Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Ashford, I want to say something that I did not say clearly enough in the study." She waited. "When I made that proposal, I made it plainly and practically, and I don't apologize for the plainness, because I think you prefer plain. But I want to be clear about something I left out." He held her gaze. "What I said about 14 months of evidence, that was true. What I didn't say was that evidence doesn't explain everything. There are things in 14 months that don't go in a ledger. The way you spoke to that frightened housemaid about a loose hem. The way you handled the Caldwell woman this afternoon without once lowering yourself to her level. The way you stood in front of me in this hallway." He paused. 2 seconds. "You let yourself have 2 seconds before you straightened up and walked back in." Her breath caught. "I notice things," he said simply. She looked at him. The authorization document was in his hand, and her father's name was on it. And the afternoon was ending, and somewhere on the road to Philadelphia, a rider was carrying the evidence that would rewrite 8 years of the story she had been told about her own life. "That," she said, very quietly, "was the least practical thing you've said all day." "Probably," he said. Something loosened in her chest. A thing she hadn't known was held tight until she felt it go. Not relief, not warmth, not yet. Something that was simply the absence of bracing, the cessation of the constant low-grade effort of holding herself at a careful remove from everything that hadn't yet proven safe. "I need to speak to Tilda," she said, "and check on the kitchen staff. The afternoon was disrupted, and someone needs to make sure the household still runs tonight." "It does," he agreed. "It will." She moved toward the back of the house, and then she stopped without turning around, because something needed to be said, and she didn't know how to say it, facing him directly, which was itself information about something she wasn't ready to look at yet. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Yes?" "Thank you. For the rider. For the 4 months." She paused. "For looking behind the story." He said nothing for a moment. "Your father was a decent man," he said. "Mrs. Price said it to you not an hour ago, and I heard it across the room. She's right. He was. And decent men deserve better than what happened to him." Another pause. "So do their daughters." Nora pressed her lips together and kept moving. Behind her, she heard him go the other direction, back toward the study, back toward the documents and the preparations for the night ahead. And she walked through the door into the part of the house that she knew how to manage. And she let herself, just briefly, just for a moment, feel the full weight of what had shifted. Her father had not failed. The ground she had been standing on for 8 years had just turned out to be a different kind of ground entirely. She had a great deal of rebuilding to do. But for the first time in a very long time, she thought she might know where to begin. The federal deputies arrived at 10:30. Nora heard them from the kitchen, the sound of horses on the drive, the voices of men who carried authority in their posture before they ever opened their mouths. She had been sitting with Tilda for the past hour, not because Tilda needed sitting with anymore, but because Nora needed somewhere to put her hands while her mind worked through the shape of everything that had happened. And Tilda's mending basket was the most familiar thing in the house. She set down the stocking she'd been repairing and went to the hall. There were 3 of them. Federal men out of Winchester, badges worn plain on their coats. The kind of men who didn't need to announce themselves, because everything about them already had. The Duke was receiving them in the entrance hall, with Levi beside him. Levi had apparently turned around and ridden back after confirming the documents were on their way to Philadelphia, which told Nora something about the loyalty the Duke inspired in the people who worked closest to him. She stood at the edge of the entrance and waited.
The senior deputy, a lean man named Garrett with a face like weathered oak and eyes that missed very little, looked at her the moment he entered the room, and then looked at the Duke and said, "Is this her?" "Miss Nora Vane," the Duke said, "named beneficiary in the Vane Trust. She'll give her statement tonight, if you're ready to take it." "Ma'am," Garrett said, and there was nothing complicated in the word, just acknowledgement, clean and direct. "Deputy," she said. They went to the study. Garrett took her statement with the methodical patience of a man who had done this many times, and understood that the value of a statement was in its precision, not its speed. He asked her questions she hadn't expected, not just about the trust account and the documents, but about her father, about the business, about the timeline of events as she had lived through them from the inside. When did she first know the company was in trouble? How did the legal dispute present to the family? What did her father believe had happened? She answered everything. She didn't embroider, and she didn't minimize. She told it the way it had been. A family watching a man they loved spend 4 years being methodically destroyed by a process he trusted and a system he didn't know had already been purchased. At one point, Garrett stopped writing and looked up at her. "You're certain about the timeline," he said. "June 1807 for the fund redirection." "The ledger shows it clearly." "And Harwick's name is in the authorization line." "In his own hand. I've seen it." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "You're a composed woman, Miss Vane." "I've had time to be angry," she said. "I did that part earlier." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He went back to writing. The Duke sat across the room through the entire interview, not hovering, not interfering, just present. She was aware of him, the way she had been aware of him all afternoon. The way you're aware of the one steady thing in a room that has a lot of movement in it. When Garrett finally closed his notebook and said they had what they needed, the Duke walked the deputies to the door himself and came back to find Nora still in the study, still sitting precisely where she'd been for the past hour and a half. "You should sleep," he said. "Probably," she said. She didn't move. He didn't tell her again. He crossed to the desk and poured 2 glasses from the decanter on the corner shelf. Something amber, something that smelled of oak and age, and set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. She picked it up. She didn't drink it immediately. She just held it. "Harwick talked to the deputies," she said. "He did." "What did he say?" "That he acted alone, that the other individuals involved in the county land office scheme were unaware of his methods." He paused. "Which is not true, and Garrett knows it's not true, but it will take time to unwind." "How much time?" "Months, possibly longer." He looked at her. "The case against Harwick himself is solid. The broader network is more complicated." Nora turned the glass in her hands. "My father's money," she said. "The 4,000. Is there any possibility of recovery?" "That's a question for the Philadelphia Trust proceedings, but yes, there's a possibility. The account it was redirected to still exists in some form. These things can be traced." He paused. "I don't want to make promises I can't guarantee." "I'd rather you didn't," she said. "I've had enough of the other kind." She drank. The whiskey was better than anything she'd tasted in years, which was a very small and entirely inappropriate thing to notice, given the totality of the evening. And she noticed it anyway. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Cedric," he said. "Given everything." She looked at him. "That's a significant shift in one afternoon." "It's been a significant afternoon." She set the glass down. "Cedric."
The name sat strangely in her mouth. Not badly, just unfamiliarly, the way a new tool feels before your hand learns the weight of it. The proposal you made, in the cold light of, well, 10 o'clock on what has been the longest day of my recent life. Do you still mean it? He looked at her without hesitation. Yes. You understand that the county will not simply find it unusual. They'll find it offensive. 10 families of standing came to this house today. You dismissed their daughters and chose the housekeeper. The story that's being told in every parlor between here and Fredericksburg right now is not a kind one. I'm aware. It will affect your business dealings, your social position. There are men who will use it to question your judgment in other arenas. There are men who've been looking for reasons to question my judgment for years, he said calmly. They'll manage. I'm serious, she said. So am I. He looked at her steadily. I'm not unaware of the costs, Nora. I'm telling you, they don't change my answer. She sat with that for a moment. Why? I told you why. You told me 14 months of evidence. You told me household management and account figures and the way I spoke to Tilda about a hem. She met his eyes. Those are good reasons. They're practical reasons. I respect practical reasons. But they don't explain. She stopped, searching for the word. The certainty. You weren't uncertain today, not for a moment, and I want to understand that. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he said, 8 months ago, February. There was a fire in the East storehouse. You remember it. The linens, she said. Yes. The house was in chaos for half the night. I came down at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep with the noise, and you were in the back corridor with a ledger and a candle, cataloging what had been lost so the insurance claim could be filed accurately. Not the next day, not when it was convenient. At 2 in the morning, alone, because you understood that the claim would be stronger if the inventory was documented while the event was still fresh. She remembered the night. She had not known he had seen her. That was housekeeping, she said. That was character, he said. You could have waited until morning. No one would have known the difference. You did it because it was the right way to do the thing, regardless of who was watching. He paused. I was watching. Something moved through her chest, slow and careful and unmistakable. That's still practical, she said, but her voice had shifted, and they both heard it. It is, he agreed. But the reason I couldn't sleep was that I'd been thinking about you for 3 hours, and practicality doesn't account for that particularly well. The fire in the grate made a sound. Outside, somewhere in the drive, one of the deputy's horses shifted and stamped. The house was entirely quiet in the way that large houses are quiet late at night, full of small sounds that only become audible when the larger ones have gone. Nora looked at him. She thought about all the ways she had been looked at in her life. Looked through, looked past, looked at with assessment and calculation, and the particular sideways attention of people who were deciding whether she was worth their time. She thought about how she had learned to occupy the edges of rooms and make herself easy to overlook. He had not overlooked her. He had been looking, careful and consistent, for 8 months, maybe longer. I need to know something, she said. Ask it. If the legal proceedings go badly, if the Philadelphia case is complicated, if the recovery is partial or doesn't happen at all, does any of this change? No. You're certain? I'm certain, he said. The proposal I made to you was not contingent on your inheritance. I mentioned it because you have a right to know it exists. But your father's money is not the point. He met her eyes. You are the point. She breathed out, a long, slow breath, the kind that carries more than air.
"All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I said yes this afternoon," she said. "I'm saying it again now, so you know it wasn't only the momentum of the afternoon that said it." Something in his expression did a quiet thing. A softening, controlled and brief, but real. "I appreciate that." She stood. She was tired in the specific, deep way of a person who has been operating at full capacity for 16 hours. And the tiredness had weight. "I'm going to bed," she said. "And tomorrow, when this house wakes up and the deputies are gone and the work of it all begins in earnest, I'm going to need to know exactly where we stand legally and what the next steps are. I'll have everything ready. And Tilda needs to know her position is secure. She's been rattled all day. Tell her." "I will." She moved toward the door. She stopped. Not the way she'd stopped in the hallway earlier. Not with her back to him, but turned, facing him. "You said you noticed things." "I did." "Then notice this." She held his gaze. "I am not a woman who does well with being managed. I've been managed by circumstance for 8 years, and I'm finished with it. If we do this, whatever this becomes, I need to know that my voice carries genuine weight, not courtesy weight, not you indulging me because it's easier than arguing. Real weight." He looked at her for a moment. "The legal strategy," he said. "The timing of the Philadelphia filing. The decision to involve Levi rather than another man. All of that I decided today, based in part on your read of the situation. You said Harwick saw the ledger. I believed you. I moved the timeline. That's not courtesy." He paused. "Does that answer the question?" It did. She wouldn't tell him that quite yet. "Good night, Cedric," she said. "Good night, Nora," he said. She went to bed and did not sleep for 2 hours. She lay in the dark and thought about her father. Really thought about him. Not the managed version of thought that she'd practiced for years. The kind that stayed on the surface and didn't go looking for things it couldn't afford to find. She thought about the man he had actually been. The way he read aloud at the dinner table. The particular patience he had with merchants who owed him money. The way he always said there was a reason people couldn't pay, and you were better served finding the reason than demanding the money. The way he had sat her down at 15, in the weeks after the fire, and before they understood how bad it was going to get, and told her that a woman who could manage a set of accounts and hold her own counsel would never truly be without resources. As if he had known, even then, what she was going to need to know. He had known something was wrong. She understood that now. Reading it backward through the new information, hearing his voice in the memory differently, he had known the proceedings were moving wrong. He had not known why, and the not knowing had cost him everything. Because a decent man assumes bad luck before he assumes betrayal. And Harwick had known exactly how to use that assumption. She pressed her hands flat against the blanket. He had not failed. He had been robbed by a man he trusted, in a system that was supposed to protect him, and he had gone to his grave, believing the failure was his own. 8 years she had carried that weight alongside the ghost of it. She was done carrying it. She was up before sunrise. The household had the particular early morning quality of a place that had been through a great deal the day before, and was now, collectively, silently, reassembling itself. Tilda was in the kitchen when Nora came through, and she looked up with the expression of a young woman who had spent the night deciding whether to be frightened or curious, and had landed somewhere between the two. "Is it true?" Tilda said. "What they're saying downstairs?" "What are they saying downstairs?" "That Mr. Harwick was taken by federal men, and that—" She stopped. "About you, miss, and Mr. Ashford." "What about us?" Nora said, pouring water for the kettle with the methodical calm of someone whose hands knew what to do, even when the rest of her was still finding its footing. Tilda watched her. "That you're going to marry him." "That's between Mr. Ashford and me for the moment," Nora said. But you're not denying it, Tilda said. Nora looked at her. Your position in this house is secure, Tilda. Whatever happens or doesn't happen, I want you to know that plainly. Tilda blinked. Then, the pure, uncalculated relief of a 16-year-old who'd been frightened and hadn't wanted to show it. Her face went soft. Thank you, miss. Thank me by keeping that hem from coming loose again, Nora said. I haven't got the patience to repair it a third time. The morning moved fast after that. A letter arrived from Arabella Caldwell before 9 o'clock, which was so unexpected that Nora turned it over twice before opening it, looking for some indication that it was meant for someone else. It was not. It was addressed to her, in Arabella's distinctive slanted hand, on good paper. Miss Vane, I told my mother last night that whatever happened in that house was your business and none of ours. She disagreed. I persisted. I am writing to say that I hope things go well for you, and that I meant what I didn't say yesterday, which is that you are the only person in that entire room who spoke to me like a person and not a candidate. That is worth something. AC. Nora read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket and said nothing about it to anyone. The Duke came to find her mid-morning. She was in the accounting room, the small office off the main corridor where the household ledgers were kept, going through the domestic accounts with the focused attention of a woman who understood that chaos had a way of creating gaps in records if you let it, and gaps in records had consequences. She heard him in the doorway before he spoke. The Philadelphia Trust House sent a response rider, he said. Fast turnaround. They've confirmed receipt of the documents and opened a formal inquiry. That's quick. Levi is persuasive. He crossed to the desk and set a letter in front of her. This came with it. She looked at it, a formal letter from the Trust House, signed by a senior officer, confirming the inquiry and listing the documents under review. Her name was in the opening line, Miss Nora Vane, named beneficiary. She had never seen her own name in a formal legal document before. It looked strange and right at the same time. They'll want you to appear in person at some point, he said. Philadelphia. I'd come with you. As what? She said. Your employee or your... As my intended, he said, if you're willing for that to be known. She looked up at him. You're moving quickly. The story is already out. 3 counties. It'll be in Richmond inside a week. If we're going to do this, I'd rather do it from a position of clarity than spend the next several months managing other people's speculation. Practical. Still entirely practical. She was beginning to understand that his practicality was not a substitute for feeling. It was how his feeling expressed itself. The man planned for things he cared about. The thoroughness of the plan was the measure of the caring. All right, she said. You're intended. I'll make the formal announcement by the end of the week, he said. And I'd like... He paused, briefly, and the brief pause was its own thing. I'd like to know, before I do, what you want the announcement to include. About your father, about the proceedings. Some of it will come out regardless, but you should have a say in how it comes out. She looked at him for a long moment. I want people to know he didn't fail, she said. That's the part that matters. The money, the legal proceedings, all of it. That's detail. The thing I need said clearly, in whatever form it takes, is that Thomas Vane was a decent man who was wronged by a dishonest one. And the record is being corrected. That's what I'll say, he said. You'll say it directly, not through implication? Directly, he said. I'm not a man who does well with implication. She almost smiled. No, she said. I've noticed. He reached into his coat. He produced something small. Not a ring, which was what she half expected, what the situation might have called for in the hands of a man who worked in symbols. What he produced was a key. Old iron, plain-headed, the kind used for strong boxes or document cases. She looked at it. "What is this?" "The document case where I've been keeping the trust materials," he said. "The original authorization record, the ledger copies, the evidence trail, all of it." He set the key on the desk in front of her. "I want you to have the other key." "Why?" "Because they're your documents," he said simply. "Your father's account, your inheritance. The case and everything in it belongs to you more than it does to me. I should have given this to you yesterday." She looked at the key on the desk. 8 years. She had spent 8 years on the outside of the story of her own family's ruin, receiving it secondhand, carrying the weight of it without ever being the one who held the record of it. And here was the man who had spent 4 months quietly, carefully assembling that record, setting it down in front of her and saying, "This is yours." She picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. Or maybe that was just what it felt like, to hold something that changed the shape of everything that came before it. "Cedric," she said. "Yes." "I have to ask you something that I should have asked before I said yes, and I apologize for the order of it." He waited. "What kind of man are you?" she said. Not the practical answer, not the 14 months of evidence. What kind of man are you when there's nothing at stake? When the legal proceedings are finished and Harwick is dealt with, and there's no crisis to manage and no problem to solve. What are you like then? He was quiet for a long moment. It was the first time she had seen him take his time with an answer, and the taking of it told her something. "Quieter than I seem today," he said. "I work too much. I'm not particularly good at ease, at just sitting. I read late and I wake early, and I prefer plain food to elaborate cooking, and I don't enjoy large social gatherings, which, given today, will strike you as ironic." He paused. "I'm not an easy man to live alongside." "I didn't ask for easy," she said. "No," he said. "You asked for honest and real weight, and those things I can give you." He met her eyes. "I'm not perfect, Nora, and I'm not performing a character for you right now. The man you have been in this house with for 14 months, that is largely the man I am. More formal in the mornings, less patient when I'm tired, but not different in any fundamental way." She turned the key over in her hand. "I can work with that," she said. Outside the accounting room door, the household was resuming its daily shape. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning, servants moving through the work of the house, the smell of bread from the kitchen, the quiet mechanical turning of a domestic life that had yesterday been shaken to its foundations and was today, nonetheless, still running. Because that was what households did. That was what life did. It kept running. "I want to go to the churchyard," she said. "Not today, but soon. My father is buried in Staunton. I want to go and tell him." She paused. "Is that strange?" "No," he said, without any hesitation at all. "I'll take you." She looked up at him. The key was in her hand, and the letter with her name on it was on the desk in front of her. And somewhere in a document case on the floor above was the full recorded truth of what had been done to her father and who had done it. "All right," she said, for the third time in 24 hours. It was becoming, she thought, the word she used when something was exactly true and exactly right, and she didn't need any other words around it. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before, with that quiet, specific attention that she was learning to read, that meant he was seeing something he considered worth seeing. "The announcement," he said. "By the end of the week." "By the end of the week," she agreed. She went back to the household accounts. He went back to the study. The morning moved forward, steady and purposeful, carrying everything with it. The grief and the revelation and the strange new weight of a future that looked nothing like the one she had been managing toward. Thomas Vane had been a decent man. His daughter was going to make sure the world knew it. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The end of the week came faster than Nora expected. She had known, in an abstract way, that the announcement would produce consequences. She had anticipated talk. The county was made of talk, and what had happened at Ashford Manor on that October Tuesday was the kind of material that talk could live on for months. What she had not fully anticipated was the speed of it, or the specific forms it would take, or the way it would arrive at her door before she had finished deciding how she felt about it herself. The first letter came from Mrs. Caldwell on Wednesday. It was addressed to Nora directly, which was in itself notable, since a woman of Mrs. Caldwell's position addressing correspondence to a former housekeeper represented a significant revision of her personal hierarchy. The letter was short, formal, and so carefully constructed to say nothing while implying everything that Nora read it twice before concluding it amounted to a warning dressed as a courtesy call. I hope you understand the weight of the position you are considering. There are those in this community who will wish you well. There are others. I leave you to consider which group carries more consequence. Nora folded the letter, put it in the desk drawer, and went back to the trust documents. The second letter was from Mrs. Price, also short, also addressed directly to Nora, and entirely different in every other respect. My husband says this is none of our business. He is correct. I am writing anyway. Your father was a good man, and you are clearly his daughter. If there is anything Eleanor or I can do to be useful during what I expect will be a difficult season, you have only to say so. Nora put that letter in a different drawer. On Thursday, the Duke made the announcement, as he had said he would, and he made it in exactly the form she had asked for. Direct, plain, with nothing left to implication. He sent letters to every family that had attended the gathering, and to the relevant men of business and legal standing in 3 counties, and to the Virginia Gazette, which was ambitious, but he had told her he was not a man who did things by halves. The letter stated that he was engaged to Miss Nora Vane, daughter of the late Thomas Vane, respected merchant. They also stated that evidence had come to light in recent weeks, indicating that Thomas Vane's 1807 financial collapse was the result of deliberate fraud perpetrated by a trusted agent, and that proceedings were underway in Philadelphia and before the federal court to correct the record and pursue appropriate remedy. Mr. Josiah Harwick, formerly of Ashford Manor, had been taken into federal custody in connection with this matter. He had shown her the draft. She had suggested 2 changes. He had made them without argument. When the letters went out, the county, as she had predicted, erupted. She felt the eruption from inside the house, which was the safest place to feel it from. The servants brought in fragments of it. Things heard at the market. Things said in passing by people who assumed servants weren't listening, which was itself a testament to how little things had changed about certain kinds of people. She let Tilda report what she heard, without discouraging the reporting, because information was information, and she had spent enough years without it. Mrs. Fenwick called it a disgrace, Tilda said, not managing to hide the relish in her voice. At the dry goods, quite loud. What kind of disgrace? She didn't specify, just a disgrace in general, vaguely. That's the weakest kind, Nora said. Tilda grinned. Mr. Garrett, the deputy, he came back yesterday while you were in the accounting room. He spoke to Mr. Ashford for nearly an hour. I know. I reviewed the notes after. Tilda looked at her with the expression she wore when she was assembling something. You review the legal notes? I review everything, Nora said. Get back to work. What the notes said was that the Philadelphia inquiry had moved faster than expected, The trust house had found not only the original misdirection in 1807, but evidence of two subsequent transactions that had drawn down the principal in ways designed to prevent any meaningful recovery claim. Harwick had been thorough. What he had not been was careful enough about the paper trail. He had trusted the county legal apparatus to cover it, and the county legal apparatus was no longer in a position to cover anything. Garrett had also said something else, which was recorded in the notes, in the Duke's handwriting, and underlined once. Harwick gave names, 4 of them, 2 in the land office, 1 in the county court, 1 we didn't expect. Moving on all 4 this week. The one they didn't expect. She asked the Duke about it that evening. They had developed, over the course of the week, a habit of an evening hour in the study. Not formal, not arranged, simply a point in the day when both of them had finished the work of it and were in the same room, and the conversation that happened was the kind that happened between 2 people who were beginning to understand the particular shape of each other's thinking. She had learned, in that week, that he did not read fiction, but read history voraciously. That he had opinions about land management that he held with the same certainty other men held opinions about politics. That he made his own coffee in the morning, before the kitchen was fully staffed, which had startled her the first time she came in early and found him at the kitchen fire, and which she now found unremarkable in a way that felt like information about something. "The one they didn't expect," she said. "Who is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "A solicitor in Richmond, name of Bellamy. He handled your father's legal dispute in its final year, the petition stage, when the trust funds were requested." She went very still. "Bellamy advised your father to file the petition," the Duke said. "He processed the documentation. He knew which trustee agent would handle the authorization review because he directed the petition specifically to Harwick's desk." She heard her own voice from somewhere flat and controlled. "My father paid him." "For 2 years of representation, yes." "He was working against him the entire time." "From the beginning," the Duke said. "Harwick brought him in specifically because your father would need legal counsel, and it was cleaner to have counsel in the arrangement than to work around an honest attorney." The fire made a sound. Outside, somewhere in the November dark, the wind was moving through the trees, and she could hear it, and she focused on it for a moment because it was outside herself and steady. "Does my father have any advocates left who weren't compromised?" she said. "Mrs. Price's husband," the Duke said. "He's clean. I had him checked 3 months ago." A pause. "And me." She looked at him. "I know that's a small number," he said. "It's enough," she said. She meant it. She sat with the shape of it, the full shape, which she was only now able to see completely, now that the pieces were all on the table. Her father had hired a corrupt attorney on the recommendation of a man he trusted, fought a legal battle whose outcome was decided before it began, lost everything he had built to a network of men who had treated his life's work as a transaction, and died believing himself the author of his own ruin. The grief of it was enormous and specific, and she sat inside it without trying to manage it, because she had spent 8 years managing it, and she was done. "I want Bellamy held accountable," she said. "Not just Harwick. Bellamy specifically." "Garrett's already moving on it," he said. "I told him you'd say that." She looked at him. "You told him before I said it." "I know how you think," he said, not proudly, just as a fact. She almost said something. She didn't. She sat with the almost for a moment, and then said, "All right. What do we do next?" "Philadelphia. I think we should go within the month. The trust house wants you there in person for the formal beneficiary identification, and your presence will make the proceeding move faster and cleaner," she said. "A woman appearing in person is harder to dismiss than a woman's signature on a document." Exactly. How long would we be there? A week, perhaps 2. He paused. It would also be the appropriate setting for the wedding, if you're willing. Philadelphia has a federal justice, and a federal ceremony carries weight that a county ceremony, in the current climate, might not. She looked at him. You want to marry in Philadelphia?
I want to marry wherever you choose, he said. I'm telling you, Philadelphia has strategic advantages. Most people don't approach marriage as a strategic decision. You did, he said. On Monday, you told me you needed real weight and genuine standing. A federal ceremony in Philadelphia, recorded with the trust proceedings, gives you both simultaneously. The timing isn't coincidence. It's construction. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to have someone build things with your interests factored in from the start. Not as an afterthought, not as a courtesy, but as a load-bearing element of the structure. Philadelphia, she said. Yes. They left on a Monday morning 2 weeks later, and the county watched them go. She knew this because Tilda told her, matter-of-factly, that people had positioned themselves along the main road out of town specifically to observe the departure, which was the kind of thing that would have mortified her a month ago, and now struck her as almost interesting. She and the Duke rode in his coach, and Levi rode alongside, and the documents, hers and his together, the full evidence trail, secured in the case for which she held one key and he held the other, traveled in a locked box, bolted to the floor of the coach interior. She had the key around her neck on a cord. It was not a pretty piece of jewelry. It was an iron key on a leather cord, and it was the most significant thing she owned. And she wore it plainly and didn't apologize for it. The road to Philadelphia took 4 days. They talked for most of it. She learned things about him that she hadn't known and hadn't expected. That he had studied law for 2 years before deciding he preferred to own land than argue about it, which explained the precision of his thinking about legal instruments. That his mother was still alive, living in a house he maintained for her in Maryland, and that the relationship between them was complicated in ways he described plainly and without self-pity. That he had been engaged once before, briefly, at 26, and that the engagement had ended when the woman in question had discovered, accurately, that he was constitutionally incapable of the kind of decorative social performance her family expected, and had chosen, sensibly, someone more suited to it. "Were you hurt?" Nora asked. They were somewhere in Maryland, the second afternoon, and the question came out of a longer silence, the way questions sometimes do, when 2 people have been talking long enough to reach the things beneath the talking. "I was relieved," he said, "which I think tells you everything about whether the match was right." He looked at her. "You? Was I ever engaged? Were you ever close to something that felt like that?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "There was a man when I was 18 who I thought was interested in me, and turned out to be interested in the possibility that my family still had resources. When he realized we didn't, the interest resolved itself quickly." She paused. "It didn't hurt the way I expected it to hurt. Mostly, it made me angry." "What kind of angry?" "The kind that decides something," she said. "I decided I would never again let someone's perception of my value determine how I understood my own worth. That I would be," she searched for the word, "self-defining, regardless of what anyone else decided I was." He was quiet for a moment. "That's why you stayed at the back of the room," he said. "On Tuesday. The gathering." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The other women stood where they were placed. You chose your position yourself. Near the wall, near the door. You picked the place in the room that gave you the most information about the exits." She had never thought of it in exactly those terms, but he wasn't wrong. "That's very observant," she said. "I told you," he said.
I notice things. Philadelphia arrived on Thursday in a gray November morning, and she felt the city before she fully saw it. The density of it, the specific energy of a place where commerce and law and human ambition had been concentrated long enough to develop a smell and a sound and a particular quality of noise that was different from anything she'd grown up with. The Trust House was on Chestnut Street. The meeting was the following morning. She slept badly and woke early and sat with the trust documents by lamplight for an hour, not because she needed to review them again. She had reviewed them so many times she could have recited them, but because she needed to spend time with them before she was asked to speak about them in a formal proceeding. She needed to remember that these were not just legal instruments. They were the record of her father's life, and what had been done to it, and the long road back to what was true. The trust officer was a man named Whitmore, precise, experienced, with the particular courtesy of a professional who had sat across from a great many people in difficult circumstances and had learned to treat all of them with the same careful respect. He received her documentation, reviewed it against the house's own records, and spent 40 minutes asking her questions in a room that was neither warm nor cold and contained nothing but a table and 4 chairs and a window that let in the gray morning light. At the end of it, he set down his pen and said, "Miss Vane, the Trust House finds your claim credible and fully documented. We will be opening formal recovery proceedings against the redirected account within the week." She said, "Thank you." The original principal, with interest accumulated since 1807, represents a considerable sum. I won't give you a number today because the calculation requires formal audit. But I want you to understand that this is not a nominal recovery. She said, "I understand." "Do you have questions?" She had 100 questions. She asked the 3 most important ones, and he answered them all. And she thanked him again and stood and walked out of the room and down the corridor and through the building's front door and stood on Chestnut Street in the November cold and breathed. The Duke was waiting. He had not come into the meeting, her choice, not his. And he had accepted it without negotiation because he understood, without being told, that she needed to walk into that room as herself and not as the woman beside him. He looked at her face. "Well, they're proceeding," she said. Something eased in him, a thing she could see now after 4 weeks of paying attention, the specific quality of his relief when something he'd been working toward arrived at its correct outcome. He didn't perform relief, he just stopped holding something. "Good," he said. He said the recovery won't be nominal. He nodded once, didn't ask for details, left the numbers where they belonged, in the room she had just walked out of. "I want to write to my mother," she said. Her mother had been in Staunton for 3 years, living with her sister, reduced in circumstances and diminished in spirit by the years of carrying a story that wasn't true. "I want to tell her before it becomes public. She should hear it from me." "Write it today," he said. "I'll have it sent express." She did. She wrote it that afternoon in the room the Duke had taken for them at the hotel, sitting at the writing desk with the door closed and the sounds of Philadelphia coming through the window. And she wrote it in full, all of it, the trust account and Harwick and Bellamy and the federal proceedings and the recovery and what came next. She did not soften it. Her mother had been surviving on a softened version of the truth for 8 years, and it hadn't served her. She deserved the real thing. She wrote near the end, "He did not fail us, Mama. He was failed by men who made it look like his own doing, and we believed them because we had no reason not to, and every reason to need an explanation. The explanation was wrong. The record is being corrected. That is the truest thing I can tell you, and I wanted you to have it before anything else." She sealed it and gave it to Levi, and did not let herself think about how her mother would look when she read it. She thought about it anyway. The wedding was on Saturday. It was not a large affair. The federal justice, 2 witnesses, Levi, who served as one of them, and a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who was a clerk in the justice's office and served as the other. A practical stranger who nonetheless shook Nora's hand afterward with genuine warmth and said, "Good luck to you, ma'am. You look like a woman who knows her own mind." "I'm working on it," Nora said. She wore her second best dress, which was the best dress she owned, a dark blue wool that had been her mother's and that she had taken in twice over the years as her mother's frame had narrowed with grief and reduced circumstances. She had thought, getting dressed that morning, about the 10 women who had stood in the Ashford Hall and worn their finest for a man who had not looked at a single one of them. She had worn gray that day. She wore blue now, and the difference felt significant in a way she didn't have words for yet. Cedric, she was thinking of him as Cedric consistently now, without the strangeness, wore his plain good coat, the same one he had worn the first time she saw him properly. He looked exactly like himself, which was exactly what she wanted. When the justice asked if she took this man, she said yes with the same voice she used for everything, steady, level, plain. When he asked if the man took this woman, Cedric said yes, and he was looking at her when he said it, not at the justice or the window or the middle distance. And the directness of it hit her somewhere she wasn't entirely prepared for. She had known he was certain. She had known it from the first day. But knowing it, and seeing it in a man's face at the moment it costs him something to say it, those were different things. The justice pronounced them. Levi shook the Duke's hand. Mrs. Hartwell shook Nora's, again with the same warmth. They went to dinner. It was a plain meal at a plain restaurant, Cedric's choice, which she had expected. And they sat across from each other and ate, and talked about the trust proceedings and the ride back to Virginia, and whether Tilda had managed the household adequately in their absence. And it was the most normal conversation she could imagine having. And she understood, sitting inside it, that normal was exactly what she wanted. That normalcy, for someone who had lived for 8 years in the specific anxiety of a life without stable ground, was not a small thing. It was everything. "My mother will want to meet you," she said. "When she's ready," he said. "There's no rush. She'll be formal at first. She was raised to it, and she falls back on it when she's uncertain." "So was I," he said. "We'll be formal together." She looked at him across the table. "You're not frightened of her?" "I'm not frightened of anyone who raised you," he said. Clearly, she did something right. Something moved through her, warm and specific, and no longer at a careful distance. She let it. She had been managing her own interior very efficiently for a long time, and she was done managing everything. "Cedric," she said. "Yes." "What you said the first evening, about the fire in the East storehouse, about watching me at 2 in the morning. "Yes." "I need you to know," she said, "that no one has ever, in my adult life, no one has watched me work and called it character. They've called it useful, efficient, even impressive occasionally, in the tone people use when they mean for someone in your position, but not—" She stopped. She picked up her glass, put it down, didn't use it as a prop, looked at him directly. "Not with the weight you put on it." He was quiet. "I'm telling you that it mattered," she said. "I'm telling you plainly because that's how we do things." "I know," he said. "And I'm telling you plainly, I will keep watching. The difference is, you'll know I'm there." She breathed out. Outside the restaurant, Philadelphia moved through its Saturday evening, full of its own commerce and noise, and the irreducible business of a city that had no interest in the 2 people sitting at a table inside it.
resolving something that had been building since an October afternoon, when a man looked to the back of a room full of candidates and chose the one nobody had come to choose. They left Philadelphia on Monday morning. She held the key around her neck and the letter from Mrs. Price in her coat pocket, and the knowledge of the trust proceedings in the place where the old grief had been. They were not the same shape. They were not interchangeable. But one had made room for the other, and she was learning how to carry both. 3 days from home, a letter caught up to them on the road. Express from Staunton, in handwriting she recognized before she had finished breaking the seal. Her mother's hand, which had been shaking for 3 years, and was still shaking, but shaking differently now, she thought. Or maybe she only thought so because she needed it to be so. Her mother had written 6 words in the center of the page, surrounded by empty white space, as if they needed room. He didn't fail us. Thank God. Nora folded the letter, pressed it against her chest for exactly 2 seconds, the same count she had given herself in the hallway outside the study on the first day. Then she straightened her spine and opened her eyes and looked at the road ahead, which was long and familiar, and led, at the end of it, home. Her name was Nora Ashford now, and her father had been a decent man, and the record had been corrected. And she was done, completely and finally done, standing at the back of any room.